Hi, I'm William Wallace, and my presentation is on the career of being a bush pilot. So let's talk about what is a bush pilot. A bush pilot is, first off, a uniquely skilled pilot who flies small, lightweight single-engine airplanes that are specifically adept at maneuvering to land almost anywhere. They fly into some very challenging and dangerous environments. They often fly into the world's most remote locations, such as the Alaskan wilderness, northern Canadian Rockies, African Sahara, and Australia's outback. The unique skill set possessed by bush pilots has to range from expert operation of that agile aircraft. Uh, it would help if they're mechanically inclined and know basic first aid. Because after all, if a bush pilot flies into the middle of nowhere and breaks down or gets hurt, the best person to immediately help them is their self. So let's talk about where bush pilots fly. So, bush pilots have flown their planes into almost any environment imaginable, from snowy tundras to arid deserts to mountaintops to dry riverbeds. Bush pilots land their plane almost anywhere they can fit it. Some experienced bush pilots can get their plane to take off and land as little as 10 feet, with the wind cooperating, of course. The only places you are unlikely to find bush pilots and planes is densely populated urban areas. So, who do bush pilots fly? Bush pilots carry a wide range of passengers for a pretty big range of reasons. In some remote towns and villages found in northern Canada or Alaska, weekly flights on bush planes are the easiest transport to or from more developed areas. Many of these communities rely on the planes for support and supplies transport, as well as medical transport, because in many cases, ground-based transportation could take days. In more touristy parts of Alaska, bush planes are a pretty popular attraction and take passengers on sightseeing flights or to fly them to remote camping and hiking spots. Also common in Alaska are bush pilots for hire specifically for hunting and fishing expeditions. Many of these flights are tourist-oriented but are enjoyed by locals as well. Lastly, missionaries in remote parts of the world often get to their final destination on a bush plane. Like we saw with Mission Aviation Fellowship, many missionary pilots are also skilled bush pilots. So let's talk about required training for bush pilots. As far as being a bush pilot goes, just like other pilots, they need to first have their private pilot certificate in their category and class of airplane. This means they need to have an extra endorsement if they plan to fly float planes or tail draggers, like is most common. Most bush pilots have their commercial license, so that is to fly for hire, as well as their instrument rating. You might be thinking, is an instrument rating really necessary for bush pilots to have? Won't most of their flights be in VFR conditions when landing in these hazardous environments? And yes, that's true, but having an instrument rating expands their commercial license utility capabilities by allowing them to fly for hire at night or for hire on cross-country flights longer than 50 miles, and that comes in handy when you're trying to cross Alaska. Besides these ratings, there are bush pilot schools that teach short takeoff and landing techniques and how to determine if a soft or rough surface is landable. While not required by the FAA or any regulating organization, practicing at a bush pilot flight school is probably the better decision than, for example, buying a tail dragger and flying out to the Alaskan wilderness with no experience landing on short, rocky, muddy strips. So that brings us to equipment. So the first thing you notice about bush planes is the big tires. They're the number one choice by bush pilots and often the first modification made to any bush plane. The fat tires enable the pilot to soak up hard terrain when performing short landings or when taxiing over soft terrain standard tires designed for the tarmac would otherwise sink into. Logically, skis are preferred over the fat tires for winter flights or flights near the poles that experience snow year-round. Float planes do fly similarly remote locations, but some pilots in the bush community do not consider them as true bush planes, as they are incapable of landing in the bush, so to speak. Another thing commonly found on bush planes are enhanced flaps and slats to increase lift and slow maneuvering performance. So let's go back and look at weather. As I mentioned earlier, it is helpful for a bush pilot to hold an instrument rating. However, the vast majority of bush flights are flown in VFR conditions. This is due to two reasons. One, the pilots need to see and avoid trees and other obstacles when they're landing at these unimproved natural sites. And two, Most bush planes are so small and agile that they can fly low and slow to avoid getting into the clouds in the first place. So this allows them to complete flights in VFR conditions that your average single-engine plane could not. Let's look at employment. Employment for bush pilots is typically pretty spread out geographically speaking. For example, there's not too many bush pilot opportunities in developed areas such as Europe or the lower 48. But for those looking for a career in being a bush pilot, you can expect to find piloting jobs in places like we previously discussed, in more remote regions such as Alaska, Canada, Africa, and Australia. So for current opportunities to fly as bush pilots, you may look at tourism and hunting industries. One of those companies is Alaskan Air Taxi, or for more mission-oriented organizations, you might look at Mission Aviation Fellowship. We looked at Mission Aviation Fellowship back in the Week 2 discussion board, and from what we found on their site, they are looking for qualified pilots currently, with growing numbers each year. Besides tourism and missionary work, the last remaining types of bush pilots are those for general hire, typically remote transport in Alaska or Canada, and medical-oriented missions, and those working with officials in Africa to catch poachers. The one thing these varying careers have in common are the basic skills needed to be a good, safe pilot and know how to operate these planes effectively. So here are my sources. I hope you learned something about what bush flying is and how it's useful and relied upon by many people in some of the world's most remote locations. And thanks for watching my presentation.